He's watched men die before. That's not what's bothering him. He's an officer in one of the most feared units in the German army. Paratroopers, hand-picked, trained to think of themselves as close to unbreakable. From his position in the rocks above Cassino, he's watching an enemy infantry unit come up the slope directly into his machine guns. The first wave goes down, then the second. Men he can see clearly through the smoke, falling in the open with nowhere to hide. They keep coming. He's seen retreats before. He's seen units break, scatter, surrender. That's what happens when an attack fails this badly, this fast. Except this one doesn't break. The survivors climb over their own dead and keep walking toward his guns, and somewhere in the noise and the smoke, he starts to feel something he didn't expect to feel today. Not contempt for a beaten enemy, fear of one that won't stay beaten. After the war, in his own memoirs, he and men like him would try to explain what they saw on this mountain in May 1944. They'd use words you don't often hear elite German soldiers use about the men trying to kill them. Words like respect, like disbelief. One line shows up again and again in the German accounts of this battle, almost like the men who wrote it couldn't quite believe they were the ones saying it. They fought bravely. What none of these German paratroopers knew, what almost nobody watching this battle from the outside knew, was who these soldiers actually were and what had already been taken from them before they ever set foot in Italy, or that the very country they were bleeding to liberate had, in a sense, already been quietly handed to someone else, in a room these soldiers weren't in by the very allies they were fighting for. This is the story of the Polish Corps at Monte Cassino. It's the story of a mountain that had already beaten 4 nations before the Poles ever reached it. And it's the story of why the men who eventually took it, men the Germans would come to describe as impossible to stop, were fighting for a home that some of them would never see again, for reasons that had nothing to do with the battle at all. To understand why these soldiers fought the way they did, you have to go back 5 years to a country that no longer technically existed. In September 1939, Poland was invaded from the west by Nazi Germany. 17 days later, it was invaded from the east by the Soviet Union, acting on a secret pact the 2 dictatorships had signed weeks earlier. Between them, they erased Poland from the map. What happened next to the people caught on the Soviet side of that line is where this story really begins, and it's brutal in a way that doesn't always make it into the popular memory of the war. Soviet secret police rounded up hundreds of thousands of Polish soldiers, police officers, teachers, and their families, loaded them into cattle cars, and sent them east. Not to prison camps in any ordinary sense, to logging camps in Siberia, to mines in Kazakhstan, places designed to consume people slowly through cold and hunger and forced labor, until there wasn't much left of them. Estimates of how many were deported range from 300,000 to over 1 million. Then in June 1941, something changed the entire calculation. Hitler broke his pact with Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union. Overnight, Stalin needed allies, and one of the cheapest allies he could manufacture was already sitting in his own camps, starving, but still alive and still furious. A month later, Stalin signed an agreement releasing Polish prisoners to form an army. Among those released from Moscow's Lubyanka prison, after enduring interrogation there himself, was a cavalry officer named Władysław Anders. He would spend the rest of the war rebuilding something out of the wreckage of what Soviet captivity had left behind. It wasn't really an army when it started. It was a column of walking skeletons, moving south across Soviet territory toward the one exit Stalin allowed. Roughly 78,000 soldiers and 37,000 civilians eventually made it out, crossing the Caspian Sea into British-controlled Iran. From there, through Iraq, through Palestine, they slowly rebuilt into something that could fight. The Polish II Corps, now attached to the British Army. By the time this force reached Italy at the end of 1943, it was made up of men who had already survived something most soldiers in this war never had to face. And the mountain waiting for them in Italy had already proven it could break anyone. Monte Cassino sits above the only road to Rome. That's the entire reason 4 months of the war had already gone through it. The Germans, under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, had turned the mountain and the surrounding valley into one of the most heavily fortified defensive positions in Europe. Bunkers cut into rock, minefields, machine gun nests positioned to cover every approach, all of it looking straight down on any army stupid enough to try crossing the valley below in daylight. 3 times other Allied armies had tried. 3 times the mountain had won. American troops had been slaughtered trying to cross the river at its base. British, Indian, and New Zealand soldiers had bled themselves out trying to take the town and the ridges above it. 55,000 Allied casualties, and the road to Rome was still closed. In February, convinced the 1,400-year-old Benedictine abbey crowning the mountain was being used by German spotters, Allied commanders ordered it bombed. Over 1,100 tons of explosives. More than 200 civilians sheltering inside were killed. It later became clear the Germans had actually kept their troops out of the building itself, holding positions several hundred yards below its walls out of respect for the site. The bombing didn't weaken the German position. It handed them better cover than they'd had before. German paratroopers moved straight into the ruins, and the rubble turned out to be nearly bomb-proof. By March, a third assault had also failed, ground down street by street in the town below by the German 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, the same paratroopers who would soon be facing the Poles. This is the moment the British command turned to General Anders and asked his corps to lead the next attempt. He said yes immediately, and the reason he said yes had almost nothing to do with military strategy. Anders believed, and he wasn't shy about saying so to his own men, that a spectacular Polish victory, visible to the entire world, might be the one thing that could guarantee his country's freedom once the war was over and the real negotiating began. His soldiers weren't just being asked to take a hill. They were being asked to buy their nation a seat at a table none of them would ever sit at. What none of them knew yet was that the seat had already been decided. Months earlier, at a conference in Tehran, the leaders of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union had met to discuss the shape of the post-war world, and the borders they'd sketched out for Poland already placed the country firmly inside Stalin's sphere. That meeting happened in November 1943. The Polish II Corps was still training in the Middle East when it did. They would spend the next 6 months bleeding for a homeland, whose fate, in the rooms that actually mattered, had effectively already been settled without them. They didn't know that yet. On the night of May 11th, 1944, all they knew was that it was time. At 11 o'clock, 1,600 Allied guns opened fire along the entire Gustav Line at once. Soldiers on both sides described the same thing. The night sky turning instantly white, the ground itself shaking under their boots. A noise you didn't just hear, but felt in your chest. Before the barrage began, Anders had his order of the day read aloud to every soldier in the Corps. He didn't talk about Rome. He talked about Siberia, about the years of exile, the families torn apart, the humiliation of losing everything to two invading armies at once. "Let the lion awake in your heart," the order told them. At 1 a.m, the assault began. 2 Polish divisions went up the exposed slopes toward the 2 positions that would define this entire battle: a fortified strongpoint the men called Calvary Hill, and an open stretch of ridge so exposed the soldiers had nicknamed it Phantom Ridge, because standing on it in daylight was close to a death sentence. They walked directly into machine gun fire with nowhere to take cover. Some battalions lost half their strength within hours. This wasn't a setback, it was close to a catastrophe. Anders made the only decision a commander who valued his men's lives could make, and pulled the survivors back before the attack turned into total annihilation. For 4 days, both sides held their ground and buried what they could. Then on the evening of May 16th, the Poles went up again. This time they didn't come back down. What happened on that ridge over the next 2 days doesn't read like modern warfare. The ground was too rocky to dig real trenches, so soldiers on both sides built low walls out of loose stone, which meant that when a shell landed nearby, the stone itself turned into shrapnel. Grenades, bayonets, knives, men grappling at arm's length in spaces barely wide enough to stand in, and underneath all of it, the smell. By May, the bodies from the earlier battles that winter, American, British, Indian, and now increasingly Polish and German, had been lying exposed for weeks. Soldiers sometimes fought wearing gas masks, not against gas, against the stench of their own battlefield. One soldier, writing in his diary around this time, described walking up the same slope past corpses that had been there for weeks, and the single thought that kept repeating in his head every time he looked at one of them: when will I be like them? And it was somewhere in the middle of this, the worst days of the entire battle, that one small, strange detail slipped into the story, the kind of detail that seems too unlikely to be real. Attached to the Corps' artillery supply unit was a Syrian brown bear named Wojtek, adopted as a cub back in Iran and formally enlisted as a soldier to get him past transport regulations that didn't allow animals or civilians on military trucks. He'd grown up alongside these men, wrestled with them, lived in their camp like one of them, and during the fighting at Cassino, while shells were coming down around the gun line, Wojtek carried crates of artillery shells to the guns on his own, upright, unbothered by the noise that had every human around him flinching. For men who had already lost their real families to a system built to destroy them, an enormous, gentle, absurd bear who'd made the same impossible journey they had wasn't just comic relief. He was proof that something from before the catastrophe had survived it. That same night, as the barrage that opened this assault shook the hills, a soldier and poet named Felix Konarski sat in the dark near Campobasso, listening to what he knew was happening to his countrymen on the ridge, and started writing. He woke a friend, a composer named Alfred Schutz, at 3 a.m. to write the melody. The song described the wild red poppies that grew on this hillside every spring. Poppies that, the lyric said, had stopped drinking dew and started drinking Polish blood instead. Within days, hardened combat veterans who'd walked out of that fighting without breaking would hear this song for the first time and fall apart completely. By May 17th, the pressure on the ridges had done what 3 previous Allied offensives couldn't. The German ring around the monastery was cracking. At the same moment, in the valley below, French colonial troops had done something the Germans hadn't thought possible: pushed artillery and infantry through mountains everyone had assumed were impassable, threatening to cut the entire German position off from behind. Facing encirclement from 2 directions, the German commander gave the order to pull out of Cassino. At 9:45 on the morning of May 18th, a Polish patrol pushed up through the ruins of the abbey, expecting a final desperate fight. What they found instead were roughly 30 German paratroopers, wounded, left behind by a retreat that had happened too fast to bring them along. After everything these two sides had just done to each other, the grenades, the knives, the weeks of hand-to-hand slaughter over a few hundred yards of rock, this was the moment that could have gone either way. Every reason for revenge was sitting right there in front of them. The Poles took them prisoner, gave them medical treatment. Post-war testimony from the German survivors themselves confirmed it. 20 minutes later, a young officer named Emil Czech climbed onto the rubble where the abbey's tower had once stood, raised the Polish flag, and lifted a trumpet to his lips. He played the Hejnał Mariaki, a bugle call from a church in Krakow, played on the hour every hour for centuries, always cut off mid-note, in memory of a medieval watchman shot while sounding the alarm for an invading army. Czech played it in full over a battlefield where thousands of his countrymen had just died to reach this spot. The sound carried down into a valley full of British, American, and German soldiers, none of whom needed a translation to understand what it meant. A country erased from the map 5 years earlier was telling the world it was still there. They had done it. 4 armies had failed on this mountain. The 5th one, an army that, officially, no longer had a country to belong to, had taken it. And this is where the story should end. If this were the kind of story that ends where it should, it doesn't. Because while these men were celebrating on a pile of rubble that had cost 923 of their comrades' lives in a single week, the political outcome their sacrifice was meant to secure had already been decided 6 months earlier, in a room in Tehran none of them had ever heard of. Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt had already sketched out a post-war Europe in which Poland belonged to the Soviet sphere of influence. The battle they'd just fought, the mountain, the ridge, the crypts, the flag, hadn't changed that outcome. It couldn't have. The decision predated the assault by half a year. When the war ended, the men who'd taken Monte Cassino discovered exactly what that meant in practice. Poland was no longer the country they'd left. A Soviet-backed government now controlled it. And for veterans of an army Stalin had always viewed as politically unreliable, going home wasn't really an option. Arrest, imprisonment, worse in some cases, most of them never returned. They scattered instead into permanent exile across Britain, Canada, Australia, building second lives in countries that, for the most part, had barely heard of what they'd done on that mountain. Stalin made sure of that too. The Soviet press gave the Polish victory as little coverage as it could get away with. He already had his own, more politically convenient Polish army fighting under Soviet command, and he had no interest in celebrating soldiers loyal to the government he intended to replace. They won the mountain. They lost the country they won it for. Today, the abbey stands rebuilt, reconstructed stone by stone from the original plans, its white walls giving no hint of what happened on the slopes below it. Walk down toward the ridge the men once called Phantom, and you reach the Polish War Cemetery. More than 1,000 pale crosses set into the hillside in careful rows. General Anders is buried there too, among the men he led, at his own request. Every May, the same red poppies Konarski wrote about in the dark still come up through that ground. The inscription carved across the cemetery doesn't summarize the battle. It doesn't mention Tehran or Yalta or the country these men could never go home to. It says only this: for our freedom and yours, we soldiers of Poland gave our soul to God, our life to the soil of Italy, and our hearts to Poland. An elite German paratrooper once admitted in his own words that he'd never seen an enemy fight the way these men fought on that ridge. He was right to be unsettled by it. What he was watching wasn't just soldiers taking a hill. It was men who had already lost everything once, refusing to let it happen to them a second time, even though, in the end, it happened anyway, in rooms far away from any battlefield, decided by men who never had to climb that mountain at all.